Yeah, Adam, if you want to kind of kick it off, I'll pass it over to you.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. My name's Adam Connor. I am a designer with Mad Pow. We are a design consultancy on the East Coast of the States. We are based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and Boston, Massachusetts. And currently there, I run our organizational design and training practice. I got my start in UX about 16 years ago. I spent a lot of my time at a financial services company designing tools and applications for customers and for agents to use. And then as I transitioned to working with Mad Pow about 8 years ago, I got into service design, design strategy. And then about 2.5 years ago, I had this realization that the parts of my job that I often liked most weren't so much the solutions that we were designing, the new products or services that we were creating. It was figuring out how to get everybody on the project, all the different roles, personalities, people, how to get them to work together through the design process effectively, how to get them to create great solutions without wanting to kill each other at the end of the day. And that really turned me on to organizational psychology, behavioral psychology, and led to the organizational design practice that we have now, which is really all about working with teams and organizations to help them become better collaborators, become better at integrating the design process into their work, at being innovators and becoming human-centric. And what I wanted to talk about today is something that comes up very frequently in that work, which is how do we, as a team, discuss and make decisions around the different ideas and options that come up as we're creating solutions. That's a common pain point, and I want to share a little bit about what I've learned that works really well in those situations. But before I do that, I'm going to be a little selfish here, and I want to do some shameless self-promotion. In addition to my work at Mad Pow, I am an illustrator. I was born in 1980, and as I think is probably required of anybody born or growing up in that time frame, I have a slight obsession with monsters and robots. And so I tend to draw them with kids doing things like brushing their teeth or folding laundry or whatever I can come up with. And I have a lot of fun with it. And I'm trying to make a little bit of a career out of it. And as I do that, I keep coming up against the same question, which I wanted to pose to all of you today. And that question is, what's the best design for an artist's website? I have to build an audience. I have to sell my work. I have to get the word out about the events and the shows that I'm a part of. And I want to make sure that whatever I have kind of reflects me, right? Reflects my style, my attitude, my approach to illustration. And so I ask this question a lot, and a lot of the other artists I know and have met over the years, they ask the same question. And the answer that we get back is very familiar, I think, to probably all of us on the line. It depends, right? It depends. It's the classic designer answer. Anytime we're asked, what's the best solution for this? How should this design work? Our answer is almost always, it depends. And as designers, the next thing that we will talk about very often is, what does it depend on, right? And we know the answers to a lot of these things. We know that it depends on the people we're designing for, right? Who's our audience? What are their needs? What contexts are they using what we're creating in? What are their expectations, right? We also know that it depends on the goals that we want to achieve. What do we want to have happen as a result of someone working with whatever solution we come up with, right? What's that outcome that we're after? And these two things, we can use these when we're thinking about different options we have, whether it be for creating my web presence, or working with a financial services company to redesign how people manage their accounts online, or working with a restaurant to rethink how people can order stuff ahead of time. Whatever the case might be, we can use these things to help us kind of direct our ideas and weed through different ideas to see which ones fit for the people we're designing for, and which ones fit with the goals that we want to achieve. But with just these two sets, we're often still left with a bunch of ideas, a ton of options that we could choose to pursue or not pursue. And so we need to add something else to this list, and that thing is very often the experience that we want to create. What do we want people to think and feel and do, and in what sequence do we want those things to happen as they interact with our solution, as they work with our mobile app, or and move through the service that we've set up for them? What's that experience that we're after? Right? We need to be able to talk about that experience. With the other two things, when we talk about audience and we talk about goals, those things are a bit more concrete. They're easier to point to. When we want to talk about the experience that we want to kind of elicit for people, the things that are going on inside their heads, their thoughts and emotions, that's a little bit harder to talk about. It's a little bit more abstract. And in talking about all these things in combination, the topic that comes up most frequently when I work with organizations is this concept of vision, right? I talk with leaders and managers, and they all talk about vision. I have to have a vision, or I have a vision of where we want to go. And they treat it like it's this flag that they put on a hill out on the horizon that we can all see, and now we're all going to march towards it. But more often than not, when I'm talking to people, different people on a team, it's not the case that everybody has the same precise vision, right? Even the person that claims that they have that vision, it's not super clear. It's not so concrete that every detail has been thought out, because if it had, well, we'd already designed the thing, whatever it is that we're creating. So it's not so much that we have a very clear point that we're headed to. Instead, we have this sense of where we're going. It's a bit blurrier than that. And in some teams, that sense is somewhat close to each other. You know, it's a little blurry. In other teams, it can be really blurry, and there can be flags all over the place, and we got to try to reconcile that. But not only do we have maybe just a sense of where we're going, and we all might be bought into that and know it's over here and in this direction, but we don't know the exact path that's going to get us there. We have lots of different options kind of in front of us for what we could do first, what steps we could take, how we could design an interaction or multiple interactions. We've got lots of different possible steps on this path, and this is where the conversation starts to get tricky. How do we choose which steps to take? And if we start taking steps, how do we make sure that all those steps are on the same path, that they all work together, that they all flow and are going to get us to where we need to be, where something that's going to make sense for our end user, for our customer. These kinds of conversations, these situations that I've worked with teams in, they've always reminded me of back when I was in school. So I got my degree in computer science, but before that, I majored in film. And as a film and animation student, a lot of the projects that I had were all involved some kind of form of having to write a screenplay, write a scene, make an animation. And very often we're working in groups. And in that project, project, in that work, we would have people, we would have roles, we would have characters, and we needed to write for those characters, and we needed to write for the actors that might be playing things, and we needed to give them something to do that fit. You know, we would put them in these situations and they had to react or do something that makes sense to the viewer. You know, if we've got this character Mike and he's in this scene in a living room and all of a sudden the murderer jumps out from behind the couch, what does Mike do? Does he scream and run away? Does he fall to the floor and pee his pants? Does he punch the murderer in the face? What does he do? How do we make that decision? What's the right thing? What would Mike do? And in learning how to figure that out, how to work with others to figure that out, what I learned most about was this concept of character, right? In film, in animation, in storytelling, we talk about the personality of people as their character. What is the character of this individual, right? What is it about them that kind of indicates to you what they're going to do when placed in a certain situation, right? Think about someone that you know pretty well, right? Someone you've known maybe for years, and think about what their character might be. What do you know about them? How have you seen them react in stressful situations? How have you seen them react in sad situations, in exciting ones? How have they talked to you? How have you seen them talk to other people? What image of a character does that build up in your mind for you? And in writing film pieces and animations, what I learned with my classmates was that if we took a little bit of time up front to help us define the basics of the character before we really started writing out the whole scene, when we got to those points where we would say, okay, well, what does Mike do now? Our discussions became a lot easier. Our discussions kind of had these bounds, and we all kind of thought in a somewhat similar direction, and it really narrowed the options for us. And you can see examples of this, you know, not just in student films like my work, but you can see things like in this work that Disney did for Big Hero 6. The animators here needed to do some case studies, some character studies to see, you know, if we've got this team of superheroes and we need them to be a little bit different, you know, what are their individual characters like? So they constructed these studies to see, okay, if we put the characters in the same scene, the same situation, how do they behave differently? What kinds of things do they do? How do they react to stuff, right? And so this is something that you see a lot of people who are planning stuff out for different scenes, for different films, use some kind of a character study to really pin down who this individual is, right? Let's think about it from the perspective of another film. Let's think about The Big Lebowski and the character of the dude from The Big Lebowski, right? The dude is this personality, this somewhat, you know, grown from the film, somewhat larger than life personality that is kind of a laid back slacker dude kind of an individual. And the kind of the fan base of this film, or the fun that the film kind of has, why it's such a great film, is this juxtaposition of this character, this laid back individual being thrust into a situation where there's kidnapping and ransom and thieves and hitmen and a lot of ineptitude on the parts of the thieves and the hitmen and other roles in the film. And people kind of latch onto the character of the dude. Even if you aren't familiar with the film, you probably are familiar with the character, the dude, right? Taking it a little closer to home, here I am, right? Me. And I wanted to get a sense of what my character is. So I asked around and I got things like, I have a hard time saying no to people. And it's true, I do. Very often when I try to say no to someone, I walk that back within a few seconds later in the conversation. I'm a perfectionist to the point of detriment. This came from some of my teammates who have watched me stress out over something that I didn't feel was exactly how it should be. I rarely work alone. I focus and structure my work to include other people. And I still collect toys and comics, and I talk about fictional characters as if they're real, right? And so this gives you a sense of my character. And thinking about it more, we can get away from thinking about individuals, and we can think about interactions and between people and character. Let me give you this example of a story I was told by a designer friend who was working for another insurance company, and he told me this story about how one of their customers got into a bad car wreck, and after taking care of everything with the police and everything, he's still on the side of the road. He wants to get his insurance claim started, so he calls up his insurance company, and the agent on the other end of the line did, I think, exactly what any of us would hope and a professional in that type of situation would do. It was, "Oh, sir, are you okay? Is everything all right? Can I do anything for you? Is anybody hurt?" All those kinds of questions to really check on the well-being of the individual. And then they started to collect the information. And then at some point during the conversation, the agent says, "Sir, I see that you don't have a credit card with us. Would you like to set one up?" And the guy's just like, "No, now's not the right time for that," right? Agent, "Well, is there a better time when maybe you'd like to talk about this?" "No, just want to get my claim done," right? So you can see in this interaction how someone went from kind of being in character, doing the things that we would expect of their behavior, to out of character, doing things that we wouldn't expect, and creating some inconsistencies. And we can think about this in digital products too, right? For any of you familiar with Vimeo, Vimeo is a video sharing platform. And if you're familiar with Vimeo, familiar with any of the work they've done, you know that Vimeo's primary focus is on the quality of content and creating quality content. Part of their mission is to give people who are working at a very high level of quality a way to share their work to a wide audience, and more power in that sharing that they wouldn't necessarily have compared to, say, a big studio, right? For Vimeo, it's always been about the quality of content. They've gone so far as to produce their own content to help others produce better content. They produce lots of articles and videos to help people understand how to better use their camera, light a scene, set a stage, whatever the case might be. Because for Vimeo, it's always been about the quality of content. Now compare that to, say, YouTube, where the primary kind of message that I and others that I've talked about this with get from it is that it's about the volume. It's about the sheer quantity of content and the size of the community, right? And that's the aspect of YouTube that comes through kind of loud and clear. And it comes even clearer when you juxtapose the designs of the two side by side. And you can see that they actually have a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same features and content and functionality. But just by the way it's designed and laid out, you can see how one emphasizes the volume of content and the other emphasizes the content itself, right? And so what I've started to notice in working with teams and helping them design their products and services is this aspect of character can become very valuable, very powerful in helping teams decide how they should go about designing something, which options they should pursue, or how they should think about different options and what shape those should take. But in order for it to really be useful, we have to have a way of talking about that. We have to have something we can point to, some shared understanding to really help us have those conversations. And that's where principles really come in. And now, to make sure I'm being clear, when I'm talking about principles here, I'm not talking about things like universal principles of design. These are things like heuristics, best practices that we've kind of taken to be good for all instances, just things you should always do, right? And what I'm talking about here is something that's a little more unique, a little more specific to the solution that you're creating rather than all solutions and all creations. Another thing that you might think about when I say principles are words like values and tenets and pillars, and I'm sure there's plenty of others that we can come up with. And I did some exploration prior to this talk to try to get an understanding of what really are the differences between these things. And I asked people that are way smarter than I can ever hope to be. We'll get lots of long philosophical discussions. And what I learned is that everybody has their own interpretation, and there's no set one specific definition that places all of these in some kind of hierarchy or nice organized form to distinguish one from another. So don't get caught up in worrying too much about, well, is this a value or a tenet? For today, what I really just want you to focus on is what I mean when I say design principles. And what I mean are directives that guide the behavior and capture the desired or the most emphasized qualities or characteristics of the creation, of the thing you're making. So I'm talking about the characteristics of the solution. I'm not talking about characteristics of how you go about the design process, like start with research or design for everybody. You know, those things are principles. They are things that are important, and you can use them to kind of govern your own process. But what I'm focused on here is principles specific to the solution that you're creating, right? It's all about what gets promoted and emphasized in your solution. And you know, so in thinking about these principles and how we can use them or where they come from, you know, it's good to think about kind of where can we get these things from? What helps us understand where these come from, and what directs our behavior? You know, if we're talking about the behavior of our solution or the behavior of an individual, what is it that really influences that behavior? If you've studied any kind of, say, behavioral psychology, you're probably aware of many models that there are out there to try to help make sense of why people do the things they do. And one of the ones that I like the most is the Combi Model. And that model here is what it basically says is that for a behavior to take place, an individual has to have the capability, right, the skills, the knowledge to actually perform the behavior, the opportunity. They have to be in a setting, in an environment, in a situation that allows them to perform the behavior. So that could be, you know, the actual physical world that they're in. It could also just be kind of like the social space that they're in, like someone in a job, you know, if they're allowed to do something versus it being something they're not supposed to do. And they also have to have the motivation to do it. It has to be something kind of driving them to do it. And once you have those three, that's when you'll see a behavior take place. And if you start to dig into these a bit, and you particularly dig into motivation, you'll find intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is the stuff that we do to kind of push people to behave a certain way, like reward them or punish them. Intrinsic motivation is about kind of what we believe and what we value and what we prioritize. And it's in here when we start to look at this that we can start to get at those things that influence our principles, that really drive us to make choices to act one way and not another, right? So let's go back to the dude for a second, right? Let's think about the dude and what are his principles. He's actually a very, very principled character. If you watch the movie and you listen to his lines throughout it, you'll find him constantly saying little things that kind of indicate what his principles might be, right? Go with the flow, take it easy, be cool-headed, right? This character, these principles have actually gotten so popular that there's been a religion kind of formed around them. You can become a Judas minister. I think they should call it Judas Priest, but a Judas minister and perform things like weddings, right? Because there are these set of principles that kind of guide you to behave in certain ways. Looking back at me and my character, as we discussed earlier, what are some of the beliefs I hold that have kind of led me to demonstrate these kinds of behaviors, right? So having a hard time saying no, well, part of that is because I was raised to believe that you should always be helpful. Whenever any situation arises and you have the opportunity to be helpful, you should do it, right? I believe that anything worth doing is worth doing right, and that is part of why I am the perfectionist that I am, right? This was a kind of a saying that was told to me over and over and over and over again by my father and my grandfather. I rarely work alone. I focus on structures of work to include other people because I firmly believe that a good idea can come from anywhere or anyone. Not all designers, not all creative people have the best ideas. They can literally be anywhere. I still collect toys and comics, and really that's just because I'm a geek. But this starts to give you a sense of some of the beliefs that I hold that kind of influence how I behave in various situations. And now let's think about how does this apply to websites or tools or services or solutions that we're building. So I did some work a while back with Harvard Business Publishing on a product they have called Manage Mentor. Manage Mentor is an online learning platform for managers to help them kind of improve their skills, their ability to be great managers. And the project, we were set to redesign it for its 12th version, right? And over the first 11 versions, they had built this massive library of amazing quality content. And the kind of the model or the idea behind Manage Mentor up until then was that here was this great content and you could look through it and read it, and if you were part of a cohort you would go discuss it. So it was very much a consumption-based interaction model. Look stuff up, read it. Some of these papers are 30 pages long, and then go discuss it and debate it with a group. And for this 12th version, the team there really wanted to step back and try something different. And so we had to figure out what that was. And after talking about it and running some workshops, we came up with what I believe was kind of one of the core principles that was going to drive the differences that we came across. And that was shift from thinking to doing. So they wanted to go from just reading content and talking about it to taking this content, applying it to your work, and then talking about how that went, and reflecting on that. And so this learn, act, reflect model became a core part of things throughout the redesign that we did, right? And it manifested in a number of ways, right? The primary kind of idea behind this was that you would be exposed to an idea, you'd learn about it, you'd act, you'd do something with it, you'd incorporate it into your work in a certain way, and then you'd think about how that all went, and you'd think critically about how you might do things differently next time. And this would manifest in things like the content itself, right? We had this large pool of content, some of it very long, and we had to think about breaking it up differently, streamlining it. We had to think about the language and the tone and the vocabulary that we were using to really emphasize this new model, right? We developed this idea of practice, right? The smallest form of action to get you to start to try to play with the concept and see what would happen, right? And then one of the things that I really liked about it, what we came up with was the idea of action plans, of not just having the design be about something that you go in, you read or do something, you get out and you go about your life. It was more thought out than that. So before you even start to learn, you set an action plan. You assess your current kind of understanding around an area like, say, conflict resolution, right? And then you go in, and that action plan helps kind of guide what you focus on, and you go in and you start learning about things and you practice them and you put them into your work, and then you kind of come back to your action plan and you assess, how did things go? You know, what went well, what didn't go well? And so now when you go out to your cohort and you're talking about what happened, you're not just talking about what you read, you're talking about what you did. You're talking about what worked for you versus what worked for other people. And it changed the whole relationship in the cohorts themselves, right? And so these kinds of changes really were really effective at influencing the design throughout the process, right? And there's some other examples. I'll give you some other principles that I've come across and liked. FAST, right, from Google. Every millisecond counts. If you're Google, you want to get stuff in front of your user as fast as possible. That's something they value, right? Wear it during sex, from Adaptive Path's Charmer, which was a kind of a vision of a blood glucose monitor, right, that they were working on, kind of a concept piece. The idea behind this was making the product elegant, discreet, and comfortable. Solve distractions, not discoverability, from Microsoft Windows 7. Microsoft said when they kind of created their update to Windows that they wanted to focus on kind of stripping the clutter away and letting people really pay attention to the task at hand, rather than kind of distracting them from with all the other stuff that could be happening on their system. And foster productive and emotionally satisfying interpersonal dynamics, from Asana. Asana is a project management kind of platform. And if you think about a lot of project management platforms, a lot of them are very utilitarian, and Gantt charts, and just tracking resourcing and hours spent, things like that, and tasks done. And Asana has a different kind of set of beliefs around this project management. They want to make sure that they connect the team, that they kind of build this shared responsibility, shared ownership sense amongst the people involved in the work, right? You can go beyond products and services. You can go into whole organizations, right? In 1969, and someone wrote the mission statement for National Public Radio. And I love this thing because it's beautiful and it's filled with so many principles, right? National Public Radio will serve the individual. It will promote personal growth. It will regard the individual differences with respect and joy rather than derision and hate. It will celebrate the human experience as infinitely varied rather than vacuous and banal. It will encourage a sense of active, constructive participation rather than apathetic helplessness, right? One of the things I love about all these statements as principles is not only do they tell you what they will do, what they do want to promote, but it tells you what they're going to not do, what they're going to avoid. And that's something I find really effective in principles, right? So principles are great, right? Principles help to discuss ideas and make decisions, and hopefully you can kind of start to see how that influences things. But where do they actually come from? How do we get them? How do we find them? How do we select them? Well, one thing to make sure is that you look at your research, right? to figure out kind of what people are saying about their experiences, how they're experiencing things today, how that makes them feel, what that makes them think, right? What they wish for their experiences in the future. Making sure that your principles align with the ideas and the perceptions and the expectations of your audience is really important, because if you're designing and promoting and valuing things that are in one direction and your audience has a completely different perspective, that's not going to work out very well for you. That's going to create kind of a division between you and your audience, right? So research is a very strong resource for starting to derive principles from. Also, your organization itself, you probably have some kind of a value or a mission statement or a brand identity or something somewhere that you can look at, and you can start to think about what kind of influence that has on you, or what that says about the personality, the character, the principles of your organization. And some of those can be carried forward into your designs. But with both of these, one very important aspect is that you don't go off and start writing down principles, creating principles on your own. These need to be co-created. These need to be kind of created by the team and owned by the team. I've seen a lot of teams struggle because a designer or the designers went off into a corner, wrote down a bunch of stuff for principles, brought it back, shared it, and then everybody's like, what the hell is this? And there wasn't that shared ownership. There wasn't that shared sense of responsibility. So we've got to make sure that we think through these things together. And so we need some ways to do that. And one of the ways that we often do it is through a vocabulary workshop, right? Vocabulary workshop is something we typically hold after research, sometimes very soon after research, and we've kind of gone through the insights together, the main findings, and we'll just ask a very simple question, like write down the most important characteristics that you think belong to this solution we're going to create, right? And write down one for Post-it. Many of you are probably familiar with this type of exercise. And then we take all of those and we kind of cluster them in an affinity-like mapping on a board somewhere, and we start to discuss them. We start to look for patterns. We pay attention to the size of the clusters. Just because a cluster is big, all that really means is that a lot of people have the same idea. Small clusters are equal as important, and I like to actually pay a lot of attention to the small clusters, because that's usually where kind of the most unique ideas are, the things that stand out the most, right? So we have these conversations, we throw out the obvious ones. We throw out things like easy to use, right? Easy to use, yeah, obviously we wouldn't want to create something that wasn't easy to use, so that's not really all that helpful. So we throw out all those obvious ones. We create these clusters and we talk about them. We figure out kind of what the themes are, and we start to break them down a little bit more, and that's where you see some of the red writing here, as people tried to pull things apart, figure out how things were different or how they were similar, right? And then we typically use like a voting type exercise, a dot voting exercise, to see kind of where do people think the most important or the strongest potential principles lie. And at that point, that's when we can start to maybe go away and try to put these into sentences that we can bring back. Because when you try to write design principles with, say, 20 or so people in a room, it can be a little difficult. But if you can get everybody to some sort of consensus around where they lie, it can be much easier to go draft something and come back. Another type of activity we've often done is, what wouldn't we do, right? What's the opposite of what we would want to do? And by thinking through that and then thinking about the opposite of that, it kind of indicates some of the qualities that we might want to emphasize. Another one that's come up and we've done a few times is role playing, where we have one individual kind of play the role of a user and another one play the role of the system. And we have them act out kind of what they think they would do. And so you get someone playing the role of the system saying, well, I think right now I would show you all of your treatment options, right? And then we ask, okay, well, why would you show them all of them rather than just a few or just the most recommended one? Well, because I think that they should have all the information, that they should be aware of everything. Okay, well, maybe that's a quality that we want to start building in to our principles, right? So we start to do that. If role playing doesn't work because you can't get people to actually play the roles, I have found that just thinking through scenarios and situations can be helpful to coming up with principles. And so take things like journey maps, right? We do journey maps all the time. We do current state maps, we do future state maps, and they're basically a sequence of events and interactions. And what I found works well is when you're doing some of maybe your future state journey mapping or even some current state journey mapping. You know, if you have your basic structure like your stages, your thoughts and emotions, the user's actions, the channels and products they're working with, and where your challenges and opportunities lie, you can think about at each stage of interaction, kind of how would we want the system to behave? What are the qualities of the system that we want? And you can tack those into your challenges or opportunities. Or I've seen some groups create a whole new row for them, right? And so thinking through kind of how does an interaction unfold and what's the personality or character of our solution as this unfolding happens can be useful in starting to figure out what these principles might be. So as you kind of figure out these principles and write them down and talk about them with your teammates, you're going to need a way to figure out kind of what makes a good principle and what makes a bad principle. So just some basic rules to think about. Principles should be clear and directive, not general and ambiguous. So things like fun and engaging are not strong principles, because what might be fun to me might not be fun to you. So we need to be much more kind of clear about what exactly we mean. Some things that you might do differently with another product or service. Principles are good when they're unique, right? They help us define kind of who our or what our solution is rather than what all solutions should be, right? So think about, does this really help distinguish us from our competitors? Does it push the team to say no to more options than they say yes to, right? A lot of this is around making decisions. And so you want these things to kind of act as a filter. And if principle can be applied to any option, any idea you come up with, it's not really helping you do that. And like I said with the NPR example, it should help you identify what shouldn't be done as well as what should, right? So knowing kind of what's off limits, it really does help to clarify even further what could be, what should be, okay? But the real test of a design principle, you know, taking those rules is great. The real test comes to how well does it help you have a discussion? How well does it help you stay focused? How well does it help you make decisions? And that's why design principles are really only useful if you use them. I've seen a lot of teams come up with them and then they sit on a giant piece of paper on the wall somewhere, but they're not being brought up in conversation. They're not being brought up to talk about different ideas, different options. So think about how you use them, when you can use them. You can use them kind of in your generative phases, your points in your project where you're coming up with lots of ideas, prompts to spur new ideas. How many ways can we come up with to make our, to shift the focus from thinking to doing, right? Coming up with lots of ideas that way. And you can use them when you get to convergent thinking, when you get to editing and revising us to shift from thinking to doing, right? And so it really does play this dual role, and bringing them up and referring back to them is really critical to their value. Also keep in mind that where you start off with principles is likely to be kind of broad. You're going to be, you know, when you're early on in your generative work, you're going to have lots of different ideas, and you don't know everything yet. You don't know how people are going to react to certain ideas. There's still going to be a lot to figure out, right? And you're not thinking very specifically about color palettes and typography and tone and things like that. And so as you go through your work and you have discussions and you see kind of where principles are useful and where you're having trouble using them, you'll find times when you feel like you need to maybe tighten up or even loosen up a principle. And just some examples of when that might happen, right? So when you're applying them to specific design aspects, like I was saying, you're applying them to content, right? So as you start to think about, well, what's the how are we going to write things? What type of vocabulary and language are we going to use? The tone, the voice. You might find that a principle needs to be clarified a bit to make that make sense. You might find them too broad or too restrictive at different points, right? If you're, like I said earlier, if you're going through ideas and you're asking yourself, okay, which of these ideas, really work for this design principle? And it seems like all of them could, and it seems like that's been the case for a while, then that design principle is probably too broad. You need to tighten it up. Or if it seems like nothing ever fits, right, it might be too restrictive. And finally, applying them to specific situations or contexts. So not all principles apply all the time, right? You're not going to have the exact same character or personality in stressful situations as you necessarily do in exciting ones. So thinking about that can help you figure out kind of when to pull in certain principles and when not to. Where I want to leave you today, kind of thinking about design principles and how you might use them, how you might incorporate them into your discussions, and how they can help you make decisions, is this story that I often come up against in different leadership seminars and things that I've seen and been a part of. And it's this story about bricklayers and cathedrals. And the story goes like this. A man's walking down the street and he finds 3 bricklayers working. And he's curious as to what they're doing. So he stops the first bricklayer and he says, "What are you doing?" And the bricklayer says, "Well, I'm laying bricks." Okay. Walks over to the next man. "What are you doing?" "I'm building a wall." All right. Walks to the third man, says, "What are you doing?" Says, "I'm building a cathedral." And the point of the story is supposed to emphasize vision, right? The thing we talked about earlier, that this third man, he's got a vision for what he's creating. He can see it, right? And that's what he's working towards. And that's great. But what I want to know is why? Why bricks? Why a wall? Even why a cathedral? Right? What is it about the work you're doing that helps you make decisions about how you're going to proceed? What first step you're going to take? What second step you're going to take? How you're going to make one interaction work? How you're going to make the next interaction work in a way that is consistent with the first one? How are all these things going to stream together? How is this going to create the character of your solution? This is where I think design principles are valuable, because design principles direct action to achieve vision. So as Walt Disney said, when your values are clear, making decisions becomes easier. And that's where I'll leave you today. Thank you very much, everybody.
Great, thanks, Adam. That was a great job here. We have a couple questions, so
Great.
Let me make a few quick announcements here, and we'll get straight to it. So I'm going to launch the poll here, and just in closing, just to reiterate again, if you have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, we do encourage you to check out Product Tribes, which is our Slack group of almost 5,300 designers, developers, and product managers. So a lot of these conversations, like today's talk around consistent design, continues in the Slack group. And of course, if you're at all interested in checking out UXPin, we are a full stack design platform, so you can create design systems, prototyping, as well as generate documentation for developers in one place. And we do have a free trial if you're interested in checking that out. And now let's go ahead and dive into the questions. I'm seeing a theme of questions around this actually, which is, so let's say you're working on a company that has already established principles.
Mm-hmm.
How would you go about conducting that vocabulary workshop if you're a new hire without seeming like you want to just rock the boat?
Mm-hmm. So I guess, I don't know if this is easy to kind of go back out for clarification, but is it because you don't agree with the principles, or you want to extend them or see how they apply to the work you're doing?
I think it might be, let's see. Yeah, I think it's more of they'd like to extend them.
Extending them. Okay. So I think the kind of the way I would approach it is, I'm usually try to be very transparent. So I try to call attention to the fact that principles exist, or brand guidelines, or whatever they're best known as in your organization, and say, I understand that we have all of these principles today, and I want to use them. I want to apply them to the work we're doing here. And then I would do one of two things. It's kind of up to you to determine which you do first and which you do second. Before kind of doing a vocabulary workshop, I might kind of walk through with the group the existing principles and say, how do we think these principles apply, and go through them one by one. If you can, a great way to do this is if you kind of already have use cases in mind for the product or solution you've got to create. You might talk specifically about, how might this existing principle apply to this use case, and let people kind of go through them together that way. And that might help you kind of take those existing principles and push them a little further. And then you could do the other piece, which would be I would say, run a straight up vocabulary workshop and say, okay, now we have these principles, and that and we talked about it today, but I want to make sure that we're not missing anything. So let's run a quick workshop, quick activity, and see if there's any additional principles that we might come up with, right? And do it that way. So you've paid homage to what's already there, and you've kind of framed your additional vocabulary workshop as, just wanting to make sure that you've covered all the bases. Now, like I said, you could flip those. You could start with the vocabulary workshop and just, make sure you let people know that, yes, we have these existing principles and I'm not ignoring them, and do your vocabulary workshop, and then go into the existing ones one by one. But I would probably do it the first way I described, is go through the existing ones together, then run the vocabulary workshop to kind of fill in gaps. Does that answer the question?
Yep, absolutely. And just a reminder
Awesome.
to folks here, I'm dropping a link in for Adam and Aaron's new book on discussing design. I've actually checked this out. It's pretty good. It takes what is normally a very like ambiguous and murky subject and makes it really concrete. I think that's what I liked about your book, Adam, was the fact that it makes it very actionable instead of just using the sort of generalities that you see out there when they talk about discussing design. So, yeah.
Well, thanks. That's what we were after.
Yeah, no, exactly. So yeah, folks who are here, if that's something that you do need help on, this book actually is quite useful. It's pretty compact, but it's very actionable. And now getting back into the questions here. So this is actually very relevant, which is, do you have any thoughts on how to craft these principles into an artifact, or at least something that a larger team can take ownership of and actually use and apply in their everyday work? Basically asking, like, how do these design principles like manifest themselves into something that a team could use?
Yep. That's a really great question. So I've seen a lot of trends now putting design principles directly into design systems. If that's something you have or are currently working on, making that part of the design system, is useful. I've seen, where it's just a document as part of that system. I've actually seen a few people play with, as they kind of include certain patterns and things within their design system, actually kind of calling out how they apply to certain principles or how certain principles apply to them. So that's one way. Another way that's super easy that both Aaron and I have done quite a bit is at the beginning of projects, we tend to create what we call a project mini brief, which is a 1 to 2 page document that summarizes the background and purpose of the project, high-level list of the main audiences, high-level list of the main goals, the main scenarios, and the principles, the top maybe 3 to 5 principles that we're working with. And then when we go into meetings, any kind of a discussion where it's relevant, we start reviewing that document, having a different person read it every time. So if I'm going into, say, a design review or critique or something, and I know I'm working on, we're going to look at a certain set of interactions, and I know that a specific set of principles, or maybe all 5 principles, are important, I'll say, as we're thinking about this interaction today, keep in mind that we want to, and then I will read through the principles. So using it to kind of start off a meeting, give people that refresher, and kind of build it into your cadence that way becomes very useful.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's actually, you actually bring up a really good point, especially with design systems. I know when we built our own design system, that design principles was pretty much after we had already done the interface inventory. Coming up with the design principles was kind of the next step, because we came up with the design principles, and then we, based on the principles, you can then reshape your components, right? So it's almost like one of the first things you'll want to do in a design system once you've inventoried everything. And the next question here, so you had mentioned role play being a part of the process and coming up with design principles. In your experience, how useful is role play in that context? Is it like a critical activity that somebody would need to make sure they build into the process?
No, it's just one way that we've found to help think through it. So, sometimes when you just do like a vocabulary exercise, you're trying to imagine like all scenarios for the product or the service, and that can be daunting in some situations. So sometimes it's just easier to think about specific scenarios, specific situations. And that's where role play becomes one tool that you have for that. So an alternative, like I said, would be journey mapping or scenario mapping and walking through things that way. Where we found role playing kind of being effective is in different kinds of, not necessarily like web or app products and solutions, but very often in service products and service solutions. So a lot of healthcare stuff that we do, having people play different roles and think through things that way has been very useful. So it's not something you got to do every time. Not every audience will be open to it. Sometimes people are very, they're very open to contributing to a workshop, but they're very kind of offset by or put off by the idea of role playing. But so it's something you can do if the kind of the situation allows for it.
Gotcha. And the next question we have, and we are getting to the end of the Q&A here, but let's see. So this is something that a lot of people probably have faced or will face at some point, which is, how do you handle existing design models in people's minds? So this person is saying, when I did a design for my employer who works in the government, it was really hard to break their sort of bias towards early, late 90s, design styles. And in the end, the interface looked terrible. In your experience, what activities help to kind of break a stubborn, stakeholder or client out of their current perception of what is good design?
Yep. And so, yeah, so that is, if everybody on the call hasn't faced that, yeah, you're gonna. Um, the way that I've found to try to get away from that is to get back to focusing on not so much on the visual manifestation of things, but what to use from the webinar, what's the character, what's the emotional or kind of cognitive side of things that we're trying to reflect. Talking about brand is often a way to kind of get around this with some executives, because when they think about brand, they start to think about kind of the personality of their company. And once you get them talking about that, then you can start to say, well, can you show me some examples that reflect that in, say, visual terms? Or you can show them some examples and see kind of where they go. Another way to do that is sometimes the role playing. One thing I like about role playing is that, especially if you are working in, say, on the technology side of things, in terms of, you're designing an app, you're designing a website, it can be because that's not a person that you're creating. It can be very easy to make that kind of cold. But if you get into the role play and you say, okay, well, how would you handle this situation? If you were in a conversation with the user and they just asked you this question, how would you approach it? What kind of answer would you give? And it brings this kind of level of human to human presence into the exchange. And then you can say, okay, well, why did you give that kind of an answer? What is it that you're trying to do? Well, I want to seem compassionate. I want to seem like I understand what the person is going through. Okay, great. So let's talk about that and see if we can build principles around that. So it gets sometimes it gets a little easier to kind of step away from the technical side of things and be a little bit more human that
way. Right. And let's take the last question here, and that will be around. So this is actually, again, another situation that somebody will probably face, which is how, in your experience, how have you pitched this process of coming up with design principles to a company where design is a fairly new discipline and the mentality has, sort of been, well, that's just the way we've always done it, for a lot of years. So in other words, how can this person push for implementation of this process when it's seemingly kind of unwanted due to a lack of knowledge?
So one thing that I've done, and it might actually even go against some of the advice I gave earlier, is to almost try to cause the need for design principles to happen. So if you're kind of in this nascent fledgling situation, you're likely still having kind of quite a few discussions around what choices to make, where you're making choices, you're putting together comments and wireframes, and then you're bringing them to a bunch of people and showing them and getting their feedback, and trying to then do something with that feedback. The way that I've kind of approached this is to, in that discussion, talk to people about, well, why would you make that choice over this one? What is it about the solution you're proposing that you feel is better than the one that we're recommending here? And try to get them to talk about that a little bit more, and use that as a way to almost draw out what they kind of assume to be their beliefs or their principles. Groups have beliefs and principles, whether they explicitly understand them or not. So drawing them out that way can be useful. Another thing to try, this might be harder in this situation, is to invite others, some of the people that you have these challenges with, into the brainstorming, into workshops where you're generating ideas, and do that for a little bit, and then get people to make decisions or point to the ideas they like best and talk to them about why. What is it that they like about one choice over another? Start to kind of catalog those things and see what kind of patterns emerge. And it's almost like you get to building these principles or identifying these principles without ever saying, I think we need to do a vocabulary workshop, or I think we need to set a bunch of design principles. It's kind of a way of pulling them out of the group kind of in an indiscrete fashion, a discrete fashion that way. So that can sometimes work.
Gotcha. And that is the last question that we will take here. So everybody, thank you for joining today. It was great having you all on and seeing all the questions. And Adam, thank you for an excellent presentation. A lot of people really enjoyed it and found it both inspirational and also quite applicable to their work. So yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will email this session out to everybody along with the slides as well. Yeah, I think next week, as part of the Design Consistency Masterclass, we have Michal Levin, who's going to be talking about creating consistent experiences across platforms and devices. So yeah, that will be a great session next Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific. Otherwise, have a great rest of the day, and yeah, great job, Adam.
Take care, everybody.
All right, take care.